Adrien Freed. The work I'm talking about, the three works, were done under my watch at the Centre for New Music and Audio Technologies, where I'm research director. But this talk is really more on a humanities arena, and it's my hat as a graduate student here at Concordia in Fine Arts and the Interdisciplinary Program. My thesis topic is how to design instruments interaction with strong cultural resonance. And it was motivated by looking at questions of why we have so few new musical instruments. Given all the technology, you would think the pace of adoption and interest in new possibilities, we would have more than the saxophone and a few others from the last 100 years. So one way to answer that question is to understand how instruments become relevant and meaningful as part of relevant, meaningful art making. And so who knows about that? Well, we could ask various experts on this, musicologists, for example, but they'll tell you, no, we don't look at instruments. You go talk to the organologists, and they say, well, we don't know anything about the design of them because we just taxonomize construction methods and sound-producing mechanisms. So go talk to the historians. Well, you ask the historians and say, oh, musical instruments, they're so old, there's no records. We don't have the design rationales. We don't have the plans. All the models, and you can trace this up to the early the first three electronic music instruments, the theremin, the martineau, the trautonium. They're all designed by cellists on the cello model in terms of interactivity, and likewise, what actually won after the Second World War were keyboards, and keyboards are nearly 1,000 years old. So why not ask living builders? So I asked my buddies, that's Roger Lynn, Tom Oberheim, who fortunately meet regularly, Don Buchler and other luminaries, and although most of them probably want to retire, they're still building instruments, and they're still just as mystified as to why their hit instruments are hits and why some of their wonderful work is completely ignored. So they're not a good source. So plan B is to look at visual musical instruments because they're relatively new, so hopefully I can recover some of the rationale. At least I think they're relatively new, but the history's just been done, and it's interesting always when historians take a look at things how far they can go back. But so that's easy. I just need to ask a visual musicologist. Well, they're really rare. Rare as hen's teeth. So plan C is to be a visual musicologist. That's why I'm here. And since I don't do it professionally, I have to shortcut some things. So first I need to identify some analyzable works. And this is easy because from the technical point of view, I know how the three works I'm going to show you work because I was there when it happened. I'm going to elaborate a theory, and I think the discussions we've had on this, well, I've already touched on this, but I'd like to emphasize the S at the end of that phrase. There's no problem with lots of value systems being active at once and being contradictory. And so far, we've mostly talked about value systems from the composer's point of view, but I would suggest if you go talk to communications theorists about reception and ask audiences something about their value systems, you might well be shocked. And if there's time, I actually probably don't want to spend too much time clearing out the elephant dung. We've done some of that in the questions, but the elephants were brought and introduced in the room, but we didn't really have the machinery to get rid of them. So I'll try and introduce the machinery, but I think really the key is to celebrate multiple value systems and look at their contradictions and why they're being constructed. So let's go to the three pieces. This first one is Sin Simple from Roberto Morales. I'm excerpting from a 10 to 20 minute piece depending on his improvisational or enthusiasm. These are the opening few seconds. So, talk about a value system that's not easy to recover. This was composed so that Roberto could win the Borges Prize, so that he could raise enough money to do his PhD at Berkeley from the Mexican government. And it worked. He did win the Borges Prize in 2005. This is Diane Douglas's class project, sound painter. Excerpt from an installation piece from Sabine Gruffat, who picked up a piece of code from my website and ran it. So let's look at a theory. Well, theory is, I'm supposed to identify patterns and structures in composers' techniques. So a good theory probably should apply to a lot of composers. So I took a quick look at all the wonderful artwork we've seen so far and collected some of the patterns. And but I was actually struck by how few of these patterns that I've seen in the ensemble are actually in these three works I'm going to talk about, and in fact I'm beginning to wonder whether they would even be considered by this group as part of the genre. Certainly the three composers of those pieces don't recognize themselves in this genre. They do lots of music, lots of projects, lots of installations. They don't identify themselves, or these works particularly, and I had a devil of a time encouraging them to even submit to this event. But let me just cover a couple of things I've noticed. Almost universally, the imagery is self-illuminated. There's no model of the world or a light source outside the objects. There's no shadows, no penumbras. I did see a shadow in the hand-drawn cats, but the shadow wasn't to say anything about the lighting. It was actually to identify the ground. A camera move, essentially. I'm guessing that this is to distinguish the visual language of this from cinema and theatre. There's very little interaction between the objects. They're in the same space and they move around, and they, if there's some transparency, there's a kind of interaction, but most of the time they're pushed around independently. And there's lots of reductive procedures to minimize referentiality. I'm going to argue that you can't get rid of referentiality, so what you're really communicating in this form is these reductive procedures. There's a lot of work to define and hide processual artifacts. We just heard a short discussion of that. So I view mirroring, kaleidoscoping, rotating on different planes from the optic of economizing computing and composing horsepower. From a musical point of view, they're like parallel motion in harmony that we're slapped on the wrist for doing too much of, because it doesn't actually add information. You can also include zippering, multiple projectors, high pixel counts, and so on to approximate film. These things, I'm not an expert in the techniques and the technical aspects of this, but they're obvious to me watching these things. We have words, we just heard in the previous talk, the idea of the tool betraying itself. Not sure why there's so much enthusiasm to hide the tool, but in these three pieces there's no interest in hiding the tool. It's in your face, a live performance. The tools are right there. The screens, anyone walking by can see it's Max MSP or JIT or whatever it is. So, I'm actually going to leave the theory part aside and move to a key piece of that theory, which I think is perhaps the most fruitful, which is these questions of provenance. Where does the piece come from? How did it come to be? Especially interesting in live performances, because it's coming to be in front of you, but obviously there's a lot of preparation. So I'd like to cut through some myths. The classic creation myth is the Immaculate Conception. Some idea came from somewhere through me. There's the other one, which historians of science talk about, which is the male birth. This is a model that's talked about a lot by Edison in his diary, about how these ideas came and he had to nurture them through lack of money and all these other challenges in life. That was the metaphor, and of course there's a metaphor of the muse. But I found it far more useful for these three pieces in particular. I invite you to look for the same thing, looking at it from the point of view of found objects. I think artists do the equivalent of dealing with stubbing their toes. They run through the world finding things that you have all these phrases, they get under your skin, things that rub you the wrong way, they won't go away. So it's interesting to look at pieces from what were they dealing with? What was it that they internalized long enough to bother to put all this effort in? And so let's go through these three pieces, but first we have to know what I mean by found objects, objet trouvé. Well, it's got a complex history, but basically the aspect I'm interested in is these irrational juxtapositions of banal materials or objects or artifacts or software or code that retain their individual physical and functional identity so that they're recognizable for what they originally were, but they're artistically manipulated and recontextualized. And of course the history is, I just slapped together some of the movements that identify themselves with the way they work with the objects. My favorite underrepresented there that's definitely worth a look at is Max Ernst, because he essentially established the methods and techniques of sampling and sound, but he was doing it visually because we couldn't actually do musique concrète in 1925. So, and here's kind of the archetypal object of Mary Oppenheim from 1936. So let's look at the three pieces. So Sabine's piece, there is so much of this particular thing going on, found objects. Every time I look at it, I find a new found object in it. But the starting point of why I got dragged into this is this piece of code that she found on our website, which allows you, with a $16 microcontroller, to make a bunch of high quality, well, relatively high quality, sine and cosine waves, so table lookup oscillator. It's a classic thing in the field, and I put it there because everyone was making these really awful sounding things. And I said, well, here's the way we've developed for 30 years to make control of sinusoids and square waves accurate and precise. And she threw all the accurate, precise bit away and went back to the 70s fuzzy aesthetic, as you heard. But the really interesting reuse she did is she copied 3 of them and piped the output to the red, green, and blue of a TV, when that's not supposed to work. In fact, engineers work specifically against that problem. It's called sound on vision. It causes that non-synced rolling thing, which Sabine really liked, and is impossible to photograph. So you actually have to be in front of this because it doesn't look like that. That's an interesting thing about we think we can reproduce in these videos what's actually being experienced, but you can't. It's a phosphor-based thing. And it was really annoying to her. This is where the thing continues to be a stubbed toe, because when she came to install it at Maker Faire, I brought a monitor and it didn't look the same. So we kept bringing monitors in and they all look different. So there's a way this interaction and these found objects have a way of pushing their banal original purpose on you, and that's what this work is about. And she's fighting with it. Look, that's a monitor casing upside down on an old roller. These are all banal objects reconfigured, and her whole artwork, I'm going to give you a quick snippet. And she does this kind of visual music, so it's definitely a conscious choice to go for the broken, glitchy, stuff. And there are so many levels of kitsch and kitsch making in her work. I don't have the words for it, you just have to look. This is an Americana film tour they did that they're new mediaizing and very subversive, lots of dithon. clearly it's about the objects they found along the way. So this is a different kind of found object in Diane's work. I'll just let that.
Within one octave, although there is an octave switch on the y-axis.
This is giant laptop trackpads,
which is also controlling the cutoff frequency of a filter. And the harder I press on my left hand, the greater a resonance we get on the filter. And of course, the harder I press on my right hand, the thicker the line is and the greater the amplitude. The y-axis on the right hand is controlling timbres, with bright colors corresponding, of course.
So, and she goes on to explain all these multiple concurrent mappings between sound and gesture, sound, and the imagery. What you need to know is why was that object, which is banal, why did she stub a toe on it? Why did she like that? This is a thing I show people to make. You can make this in about 15 minutes. 3 pieces of fabric and a staple gun and 4 wires to microcontroller, and you have X, Y, Z in pressure. She said, I need to make 2 of those right away. And the reason is, from a very young age, she saw colors whenever she performed music. And she never found anyone else for a long time that experienced that. And she's always wanted to share these colors while she's performing. And she actually went to study painting as well as music and music technology intensely. But this was the vehicle that allowed her to build the finger painting engine that was also the finger music making engine, and they're concurrent for her. So let's look at Roberto's work. And it's a little harder and so much more interesting the found object here. What you need to know is that Roberto took a class on Maya and threw together some triangles, some one of the classic sort of procedural things, a bunch of triangles lit, self-illuminated, and the problem is it evoked birdness without ever looking like a bird. This is both interesting and frustrating. And so, of course, he made it into the core of the piece, and it's called Mockingbird, and has a bird fame for the number of songs it has. What's interesting here is he's animating its position in a very ill-defined space, but with his bodily gesture. There's a velcroed accelerometer on his flute. But the bird's voice is driven by the flute sound, analyses of the flute. So this is not direct parametric mapping. So I wouldn't want you to lump all these kinds of works we're looking at, although it's just mapping, it's all about the maps. So this is more subtle than that, because this is... so where do we find the framework to understand this kind of interest? So it's a bird because of the dynamic behavior, so it's very interesting for a performer. What is this? It's an animated object, which we familiarly call puppets. And as you know, actors are concerned with dying well on stage. Puppets are always struggling to stay alive. And this piece is about how Roberto can use as many of his 30 years of tricks to keep this bird, and later on in the piece. All these pieces are available online. You can see the rest of it. There's a whole world this bird interacts in. And this includes his pioneering work in machine learning. Roberto's the reason you guys get to use open sound control, because he needed to hook Prolog up to do the machine learning in these sorts of things many years ago. And that's why we invented open sound control to send that. So anyway...
2 minutes.
2 minutes? Okay, so here's a conceptual framework. This is out of a paper of Stephen Kaplan's called It's a Puppet Tree. And the axes, especially the vertical axis of this graph, is very interesting. It's the distance between the performer and the object. So you have the performer object together at the bottom. You have actors moving further distance. A character role, which is an internal mask, an external mask. Body puppets, costuming, where you wear things. Hand puppets, rods. See the distance is going up. Marionettes, you've got the strings, remote control figures, and at the end you have a virtual performer object, which is the Mars rovers, where it takes days, it's both distant in time and space, but if you look at the teams, it's a team of puppeteers. In fact, the other axis is simply the ratio of performers to objects. So I think this is a really useful tool, and it's a really useful tool because it allows me to throw another half of the elephants out of the room, because there was a lot of discussion of the term abstract. It took me a while to figure out people were really looking at these questions of non-figurative, non-objective, non-representational. But I claim if I see something moving on the screen or I hear some change in sound, I'm immediately in the audience asking the question is, where's the gesture that did that? So the gesture is a representation. You can't get away from representation, because you have at the minimum the question of how did that move. You can try and hide behind the wizard's curtain, but we've all seen the movie. We all know, we're all interested in who is doing it. So in order to help my children with the literacy in all this, I've said, well, you're going to have to learn, you have to spend a few hours and do the first few Max MSP tutorials, jitter tutorials. As soon as they've done that and done a few patches, they know about algorithmic composition. You can't hide. They see it in everything they look at in this area. If the markers are clear. If there's a bunch of events with the same volume that aren't shaped, algorithmic composition. Visually, if it's saturated hues, geometric forms, pushed around, algorithmic composition, it's recognized like that. And not only can they get a hint, you're talking about literacy, but they can download and play with these things for a month, or the processing, and play with them forever. So you can't hide behind access, which Georgina wrote the book about it and about. You can't hide behind access. You can't hide behind the computational efficiency, because we're going to have 100 and 200 core machines on cheap cell phones and things in a few years. So where can you hide? Well, I claim the only leverage you have is narrative, because the power that composers have and writers have with narrative is the audience doesn't know what is going to happen next. And a related critique, do I still have a few seconds? Okay. There's this question of synchrony and this gesture of synchrony. There is no such thing as synchrony. You can go look at metastability and so on to find that out. The best you can hope for is syntony, entrained pseudo-periodicities, things at the same frequency, not at the same phase. Events don't really happen. Lightning and thunder don't happen at the same time. We know that. They're traces. We want the hint that the animal's about to eat us from the sound before we see it. So we're very used to, so as soon as it's very artificial to actually have the sound and visuals do a thing called an event. And as soon as you do that, I want to know who turned the switch on. So you think you're defeating and creating a new genre, but actually you're indexing things we already know about the world, and we can already see behind the curtain. So I should end with an acknowledgement of Roberto and Sabine and Diane, who are very generous with access to their process and their art. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions.
Why did you didn't add the sound with your sparkling titles?
Because I wanted to focus on the work. The work, 3 words.
It was missing for me.
Okay. Does that mean I can submit to your festival a piece of visual music?
Yes.
Okay.
Sparkling
Thank you.
titles.
I just have one very brief question. I feel it's an essential thing that you're focusing on here in other talks about literacy and instilling an awareness in an audience, just sort of touching upon the same thing. Do you feel very alone in this endeavor? Is there do you know of more people doing this same type of research?
Well, I'm an amateur at this, but the professionals study this and these questions of reception. I feel I skipped through my slide on reception, but you can look at the way to go about it is you look at these communities, the critics who all said about Ravetta's piece, he doesn't need the imagery. Well, that doesn't make any sense. He can't do it without the imagery, because that's what the piece is about. That separation is an artificial, weird artifact of the critics' value system. The curators, the peers, the performers are peer, we can be audiences, and there's a machinery, intellectual machinery for that. But it's really helpful as a composer to know that exists. Yeah.
I wonder if you can go back to your first slide for a second, because you posed a very interesting question in it, but I'm not sure I heard the answer along the way.
We have to wait till I'm done with my thesis. That's a thesis. I'm 1 year into a 5-year.
Oh, I thought you were going to hear the answer today. You've got to wait 5 years for it.
No.
Do you mind just repeating it so I can clarify the question in my
I'm
own mind?
looking at a design theory and practice for instruments of interaction with cultural resonance.
That's the cultural resonance.
That's a term I'm using for traction. No, instruments don't have to last 100 or 1,000 years. Some are, you grab a rice stalk and you make a little flute from it, or a blade of grass and you throw it away. That's fine. But it's really kind of surprising to me, and since I've spent most of my career building instruments that I get thrown away, it's kind of surprising to me. So I'm switching over to understand societally why that is.
I see. That brought to mind a quote I read in a musicology paper somewhere. I don't remember exactly where. That despite decades of development of electronic musical instruments and a lot of talk about an unlimited world of sound possibilities and so on, in the general culture, it's all perceived as one sound, the electronic sound.
Actually, it's perceived as alien sounds. Most of the instruments of the early 20s went into Hollywood soundtracks as aliens. Now, I've noticed this question. One of the audience members asked, why are there so many stars in all this stuff? Why? Because what are the self-illuminated objects in the world? They're the stars in the sky and the animals that hunt deep under the ocean with self-illuminant. And so you've chosen to reference those things. I'm sorry. I don't think I can underemphasize the desire and the ability and the correlation machinery that this is. We want to, you can fight it all you like, but we want to represent badly these things.
But that's actually just a small subset of all the possibilities out there. You have this sort of Turing test of algorithmic composition, and you use examples to very poor versions of algorithmic composition. And I'd say there's a lot of algorithmic composition out there that you don't recognize as algorithmic. And I can think of the work of someone like a David Koch, for example, who's got a fairly large body of work that you would not recognize as computer-generated, even though it is all created by a computer. And I think there's other work out there as well. So and there's a lot of computer music that sounds like space music, but there's a lot of computer music that doesn't as well.
What does it sound like?
Well, a lot of it. David Koch's music sounds like Chopin.
Does all algorithmic music?
I rest my case. It always sounds like something.
No,
well, that's life, right? I mean,
does
that's
all
a good point.
does all algorithmic music fit in the classification of your notion of an instrument? I mean, this might be this is a kind of a third position. Like he's talking about algorithmic music, but if it's not being performed in some way, how do you see that with respect to this is the large notion of building instruments?
Well, my claim is it's always being performed. The question is, can you see the performer? It's being, the puppetry may be in front of a computer, but there's a gesture somewhere.
Oh, yes.